The coffee left his hand at 11:20 on a bright, ordinary Tuesday, and I have spent the rest of my life measuring the world by the half-second before it landed. I was 9 feet away when it happened, in the sentry box to the left of the south forecourt gate, my own rifle at the slope, my own face turned to that exact middle distance where we are trained to keep our eyes past the crowd, past the railings, fixed on nothing, seeing everything. So I saw the cup leave the man's hand. I saw the arc of it, the way the lid had already come loose so that the dark liquid unspooled in the air ahead of the paper, a ribbon of steam catching the light. And I saw it strike Corporal Wren Calloway full across the jaw and the collar of his tunic, where the red wool drinks a stain and holds it like a wound. He did not move. That is the part the crowd could not believe, and the part the man who threw it had bet money he could break. Wren stood at attention before the gilded iron of Harrowgate Palace, as if nothing in the world had occurred, chin-level, gloved hands at the correct angle on the rifle, the scalding coffee running off the point of his chin and soaking into the high collar and steaming faintly in the cool air, and he did not so much as blink. My name is Tomas Hale, and at the time I am telling you about I had served 4 years in the Queen's Foot Guard of the Kingdom of Eldermore, 2 of them beside Wren Calloway on the South Forecourt post. I am telling it now because in the years since, the clip the man tried to make has been replaced in the public memory by a different one, and people forget there was ever a bet at all. They remember the ending. I want you to understand the whole of it, the provocation and the stillness and the long, strange unraveling of the afternoon, because the ending only means what it means if you understand how close it came to going the other way. Let me set the post for you, because the post is half the story. Harrowgate Palace sits at the head of a long ceremonial mile in the capital of Eldermore, its forecourt railed off in black and gold iron, its gates flanked by 2 sentry boxes where men of the foot guard stand the public watch in 2-hour reliefs. We are the ones the tourists photograph. We are the ones in the tall black bearskins and the scarlet tunics, the white gloves, the medals if we have earned them, the rifle held just so. Behind us, beyond the forecourt, the real work of the palace goes on, the Queen's offices, the household, the quiet machinery of a modern monarchy. But the public never sees that. The public sees us. We are the face the kingdom shows the world, and the first thing they teach you, before they teach you anything else, is that the face does not move. It is not that we cannot move. People believe that, and it is a useful belief, but it is wrong. We can move. There are words for when we may, a sergeant's command, the changing of the relief, a genuine emergency, the slow ceremonial march we make along the forecourt to keep the blood in our legs and to remind the watching crowd that the statue is a man. What the discipline forbids is the reaction, the flinch, the answer to a taunt, the thing the body wants to do when it is mocked or struck or provoked. We are trained to take the provocation and to give nothing back, because the moment we give something back, we have handed our dignity and the crowns to whoever was clever enough to provoke us. That is the whole of it. The stillness is not blankness. The stillness is a held thing, a thing kept on purpose at great cost, and the cost is the part no photograph has ever shown. Wren understood that better than any man I served beside. He was 31 that spring, lean and dark-eyed, the kind of soldier who made the uniform look like it had been built for him rather than the other way around. He had come up through the regiment the long way, from a town on the northern moors where his father had mended roads, and he carried himself with a quietness that was not shyness but something more deliberate. A man who had decided, somewhere along the line, exactly who he intended to be, and then simply became it, day after day, without fuss. The younger guardsmen watched him the way you watch someone who has the thing you are still trying to find. I was one of them. I am not ashamed to say it. So when I tell you Wren did not move when the coffee struck him, I want you to understand it was not luck and it was not numbness. It was 4 years and more of a man deciding, every single morning, that he would not be made to dance by anyone who paid the price of a paper cup. The man who threw it was named Dorian Vale. I would not have known his name that morning. I learned it later, the way the whole kingdom learned it later, though by then it had stopped being a name and become a kind of warning. But on that Tuesday he was simply a face in the crowd, and then a louder face, and then the only face, a man of perhaps 26, expensively dressed in the careless way that costs more than careful dressing, with a phone already up and recording before he had done anything worth recording. He had two companions, a young man and a young woman, and the three of them had the bright, edged manner of people who had been somewhere the night before, and not yet entirely come down from it. They had been at the railing for the better part of 20 minutes. I had clocked them, as we clock everyone without seeming to. It started as it almost always starts, a wave of a hand in front of Wren's face, a shouted joke. The young woman saying something I could not hear, and Vale laughing too loudly at it. He leaned over the rope barrier and made a face an inch from Wren's nose, the way men do, daring the eyes to flick toward him. The eyes did not flick. He clapped his hands hard twice by Wren's ear. Nothing. He told a story to his friends loudly about a guard he had heard about. There is always a guard someone has heard about who had cracked, who had shouted, who had shoved a tourist and lost his post for it. He said it the way you bait a hook. He wanted Wren to know that he knew the rules and intended to break the man who lived by them. And here is the thing I have turned over in my mind more times than I can count. There was a moment early when it was still only foolishness, when Vale could have walked away with nothing worse against his name than rudeness. The crowd around him was already uneasy. An older couple had stepped back. A father had drawn his small son closer and turned the boy's pram so it faced the other way. There was still a door open in those first few minutes, through which Dorian Vale could have left as merely a loud young man on a bright morning, forgotten by lunchtime. He did not take it, he had not come for it. I understood that only later when the rest of it came out, but even at the time, watching from my box, I felt the shape of something deliberate in him, a plan being executed rather than a temper getting away from a fool. He kept glancing at his phone, checking the frame. He kept glancing at his friends as if confirming something between them. Twice the young man with him said a word that might have been "don't asterisk," and twice Vale waved it off. Then he bought the coffee. There is a cart that works the ceremonial mile, a good honest cart that has been there for years, and Vale crossed to it and came back with a tall paper cup, and I watched him do it, and I did not understand yet what it was for. I thought, perhaps, he had simply tired of the game and gone for a drink. The crowd thought so too. The tension that had gathered around him loosened a little. People looked away. A woman near my box laughed at something on her own phone. That, I think, was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment the watching crowd relaxed, so that what he did next would land on them cold and unguarded and worth the watching. He came back to the rope. He said something to Wren low that I did not catch and that Wren, of course, did not answer. He worked the lid loose with his thumb, casually, the way you do when you mean to drink. He looked at his friend's camera. He smiled. And then he drew his arm back and threw the whole of it into the face of a man who had given him no cause and could give him no answer. And the bright ordinary Tuesday broke open like an egg. I have been hit in the face. Most soldiers have, one way or another. So I want to be exact about what I knew in my body in the half-second the cup was in the air, because I knew it before the crowd did, and I knew it more completely. I knew it was hot. The cart's coffee comes hot, properly hot, the kind that scalds if you drink too fast, and Vale had bought it 3 minutes before and not touched it, so it had cooled only at the edges. I knew where it would land because I had watched 1,000 provocations and could read the arm. I knew it would take Wren across the jaw and the left side of the collar, the worst place, where the high stiff wool would hold the heat against the skin of the neck. And I knew, this is the part that mattered, that every nerve in Wren's body was about to scream at him to do the one thing he was forbidden to do, which was to react. You cannot understand the discipline until you understand that it is not the absence of the impulse. The impulse is there. The flinch lives in the muscle. When something hot strikes your face, the body does not consult you. It recoils, it gasps. The hands come up, the eyes shut. That reflex is older than any oath. To stand against it, to take scalding liquid across your face and your throat, and to give the watching world nothing, not a blink, not a breath out of rhythm, not the smallest tightening at the corner of the eye, is to win a war inside yourself in the space of a single second, with no time to prepare and no one to see you win it. Wren won it. The coffee struck him. I saw the dark stain bloom across the scarlet, saw the liquid sheet down his jaw and run off his chin in a thin, steaming line, saw a single drop hang and fall from the point of his bottom lip. And in the center of all that, Wren Calloway stood exactly as he had been standing, eyes to the middle distance, rifle at the correct angle, the bearskin not so much as trembling, as if a man could be carved from the same stone as the palace behind him, and set there to outlast everyone who would ever mock him. For one held breath, nothing in the forecourt moved at all. Then the crowd made the sound a crowd makes when it has watched something it cannot quite forgive. It is not a scream. It is lower than that, a collective intake, a groan of breath, 100 people discovering at once that they are angrier than they expected to be. The woman near my box who had been laughing at her phone went silent and put her hand over her mouth. The father who had turned the pram away turned back, his face gone hard. Somewhere a child began to cry, not from fear of the guard, but from the change in all the adults around it, that sudden weather of grown-up anger that children feel before they understand. And Dorian Vale laughed. That was his mistake. Not the coffee was a crime, and crimes can be regretted, paid for, even forgiven. The laugh was something else. The laugh said he had got what he came for. He turned to his friend's camera with the cup still dripping from his fingers, and he laughed, delighted, triumphant. A man who has won a bet, and he said loud enough now that half the forecourt heard it, told you he wouldn't move. Money, mate, that's money. So there it was, a bet. The whole grotesque little ceremony, the 20 minutes of baiting, the loosened lid, the timed wait for the crowd to relax, had been staged to win a wager and to harvest a clip. Wren's discipline was not an obstacle Vale had failed to overcome. It was the product he had come to manufacture. The stiller Wren stood, the better the footage. The man had thrown scalding coffee in a soldier's face and was already calculating the views. I will tell you what I wanted to do. I am not a saint, and I will not pretend the uniform makes me one. I wanted to come out of my box and put Dorian Vale on the cobbles. I felt it rise in me the way the flinch rises, that old animal certainty that this is the moment for which fists were made. My grip tightened on my rifle until the leather of my glove creaked. And then I did the thing we are trained to do, the thing Wren had just done on a far harder field than mine. I held. I kept my eyes to the middle distance. I did not move because I was on the Queen's post, and the Queen's post does not brawl with fools, and because the surest way to turn Vale from a criminal into a victim was to give him the violence he was plainly fishing for. But I will tell you something else, and it is the hinge of everything that came after. While I held, I watched, and I was not the only one. Because here is what Dorian Vale did not know, what his timed little crowd reading had missed entirely. A forecourt full of strangers is not the helpless audience it looks like. It is witnesses. It is phones, not one phone, his friends, pointed where he wanted it pointed, but 40 phones, 50, pointed wherever their owners chose. It is a retired magistrate on a morning walk. It is a nurse on her day off. It is a schoolteacher who has spent her life refusing to look away from a bully. It is the cartman who sold the coffee and now stood with his hand frozen on the urn, sick at what his cup had been used for. And it is, though Vale could not have known it and would not have cared, a sergeant of the foot guard named Idris Coyle, standing just inside the gate in the shadow of the arch, who had seen the whole of it from the first shouted joke to the falling drop, and who was already, very quietly, very precisely, beginning to move. The discipline forbids the reaction. It does not forbid the consequence. That is the thing the men like Vale never understand until it is far too late. They mistake the stillness for helplessness. They look at a man who will not strike back and they think they have found someone with no power, when what they have actually found is a man whose power runs through other channels, through law, through witnesses, through an institution older and patienter and harder than any one fool's bad morning. They throw the coffee because the guard cannot answer. They never stop to ask who else is listening. Sergeant Coyle did not run. Running would have made it his emergency, his loss of composure, and Coyle had even less intention of losing his composure than Wren did. He stepped out from the arch at a walk, an unhurried, deliberate walk, the bearing of a man to whom the situation already belonged. He did not go first to Vale. He went first to Wren. And that, more than anything Vale had done, was the moment the forecourt understood what kind of story it was standing inside. Coyle came to a halt at Wren's shoulder, close enough to speak under his breath, his own eyes forward, his own bearing immaculate. I could not hear the words. I learned them later from Wren, and I will give them to you the way he gave them to me, because they are the cleanest example I know of what the discipline actually sounds like from the inside. "Calloway," Coyle said. "Are you burned?" "Stings, Sergeant," Wren said, without moving his lips more than he had to, his eyes never leaving the middle distance. "Not bad, cooled on the way." "Can you stand your relief?" "Yes, Sergeant." "You can stand down with honor. No one would say a word." "I'd rather not, Sergeant," Wren said. "If it's all the same, he threw it to make me move. I'd as soon not give it to him in the changing." There was a pause, the length of a breath. Then Coyle said, "Good man," and that was all, and he turned and walked the same unhurried walk toward the gate where two more of our number were already coming through at his signal, and the matter passed out of Wren's hands and into the machinery, which is exactly where it belonged. I want to stop here because people have asked me since kindly and unkindly why Wren did not simply step back. He was scalded. He was a victim of an assault, plainly, in front of 100 witnesses. No officer would have faulted him for accepting his sergeant's offer and walking off the post to have the burn seen to. Why stand there with another man's coffee soaking cold into his collar? Why give Vale even the satisfaction of having made the day strange? The answer is the whole of what I have been trying to tell you, and it is this. Wren did not stay still for Vale. He stayed still for the post. The two are not the same thing, and a man who confuses them will not last a year in this regiment. Vale wanted Wren to perform stillness so that the performance could be broken. That was the bet, the contest, the clip. But Wren was not performing. He had simply decided, long before Vale was born into whatever life had made him, that the dignity of the Queen's Gate was not a thing he would surrender to the worst person who happened to walk up to it on a given morning. The coffee did not change that decision. If anything, it confirmed it. To step down now would have been to let Dorian Vale edit the meaning of the post. So Wren stood and let the coffee cool, and waited for the relief that protocol, not provocation, would bring. And in doing so he took the only revenge that was both permitted to him and worthy of him. He refused to let the worst man on the forecourt decide what the morning meant. Vale, of course, read none of this. He was busy. He had got his clip and now he wanted the next one, the reaction shot, the part where it all paid off. He pranced there is no better word back to the rope, and he leaned in toward Wren's coffee-stained face and he began to narrate for his friend's camera. "Look at him. Look, didn't move, didn't even blink. I told you. Hot coffee, lads, full cup, right in the—" he gestured at Wren's collar at the spreading stain. "And nothing. They're not even human, these guys. It's all an act. Bet I could," and here he reached out, idiotically, drunkenly, to flick at the brim of Wren's bearskin, to touch the man he had just assaulted, as if Wren were a statue in a museum and the rope were a suggestion. His friend, the young man, caught his wrist before it reached. Door, that's enough. That's actual assault, mate, you can't." "Relax," Vale said, shaking him off, grinning. "They can't touch me, that's the whole joke. He literally cannot touch me. Watch." And he might have done it, might have reached out and flicked the bearskin and added a second assault to the first, except that the schoolteacher reached him before his hand did. I had noticed her earlier, in the way you notice everyone. A woman of perhaps 50, neat, unremarkable, the sort of face that has spent 30 years at the front of a classroom and acquired the particular authority of someone who has never once been afraid of a person younger than herself. She had been standing 4 feet to Vale's left throughout. And now she simply stepped into the gap between him and the rope, not touching him, not raising her voice, and said, in a tone that carried farther than any shout, "Young man, you will stop now." It was not a request. Vale blinked at her. The camera, for the first time, was pointed at something he had not arranged. "You threw scalding coffee into the face of a man who is not permitted to defend himself," the schoolteacher said. "There are 80 people here who saw you do it, and every one of us has a telephone." She let that sit. "You think you have made a clever little film. What you have made is evidence. Now I suggest you stand very still yourself, because the only person on this forecourt about to learn what it feels like to be unable to move is you." I have replayed that moment many times. I think it was the first instant the afternoon turned, though none of us could have known how far it would turn before it was done. Because the schoolteacher was right, and Vale, for the first time, seemed to feel the cold edge of it. He looked around, and he saw, perhaps for the first time since he had arrived, the actual forecourt, not the stage set he had imagined it to be. He saw the phones. 40 of them, 50, no longer pointed lazily at the pretty palace, but turned, all of them with a single grim purpose, at him. He saw the faces behind the phones, and there was not one friendly face in the whole of that crowd, not one person enjoying his joke, not one accomplice. He saw the cartman with his sick frozen hand. He saw the father holding his son. He saw the retired magistrate, though he did not yet know what the man was, watching him with the patient, terrible attention of someone who has spent a career watching exactly this kind of person discover exactly this kind of mistake. And he saw, last of all, the gate. Because while the schoolteacher had been speaking, the machinery had been moving. Sergeant Coyle had reached the arch. A word had gone in. And out of the gate, at the same unhurried ceremonial pace, came not one man but 4 to relieve Wren, and to walk him from the post with his honor intact, and 2 more broader men whose tunics were the same scarlet, but whose role on this particular morning was about to be something other than ornamental. Behind them, in the cool shadow of the arch, a 5th figure had appeared, an officer by his bearing and the cut of him, a man who did not stand sentry but commanded those who did. He was speaking quietly into a radio. He was not looking at the palace. He was looking with great steadiness at Dorian Vale. The crowd felt it before Vale did. There is a change that comes over a watching crowd when it realizes it is no longer watching a wrong go unanswered, when it understands all at once that the answer is coming, that it is already here, that it has been here the whole time, walking toward the thing at its own pace, and that the only question left is how badly the fool has misjudged the patience he mistook for weakness. The crowd straightened. The groan of anger became something quieter and more dangerous: anticipation. Dorian Vale lowered his phone. For the first time all morning, he had stopped recording. The relief of a sentry is a small ceremony, and on an ordinary day no one in the crowd pays it much mind. A few photographs, a murmur, the slow, precise exchange of one still figure for another. That morning the crowd watched it the way you watch a sentence being read out. The 2 relieving guardsmen marched to the post. The commands were given, soft and exact. And Wren Calloway, with another man's coffee gone cold and stiff in the wool at his throat, performed every movement of his own relief with a precision so perfect it was almost unbearable to watch. The turn, the step, the rifle brought from the slope, the heel, each motion exactly as it should be, exactly as it was on the cleanest morning of his life, as if to say to the whole forecourt and to the man who had thrown the cup, "This is what you could not touch. This is what was never yours to break." When he marched off the post, past the gate, into the shadow of the arch, the crowd did a thing I had never seen a crowd do at a relief, before or since. They applauded. It began with the schoolteacher, a single sharp clap, and then the cartman, and then the father, and then it ran through the whole forecourt like fire through dry grass. 100 strangers applauding a soldier who could not turn to acknowledge it and would not have if he could. Wren gave no sign that he heard. He marched into the arch with his coffee-stained collar and his level eyes, and he vanished into the cool dark of the palace, and the applause followed him in, and I stood in my box 9 feet from where the cup had landed, and I felt something climb in my throat that I had to swallow down hard, because I was on the post, and the post does not weep, even for joy, even for the best man you have ever served beside. The applause was not for Vale, but Vale, standing in the middle of it, understood at last what it meant. It meant the crowd had chosen. It meant that whatever clip he had captured, whatever bet he had won, the 80 people around him had already silently returned a verdict, and it was not the one he had paid for. He tried to leave. That is the moment people most misremember, so let me be precise. Vale did not stay to face anything. The instant the applause made the crowd's mind plain, he turned to his 2 companions and said something low and fast, and the 3 of them began to move, not running, not yet, but folding themselves into the crowd, heads down, the phone pocketed, making for the open end of the forecourt where the ceremonial mile ran down toward the city, and a man might lose himself among the tourists. He did not get 10 feet. It was not a guard who stopped him. It was the retired magistrate. The man stepped out of the crowd directly into Vale's path, an older gentleman, slight in a good plain coat, with the kind of unbothered stillness that I recognized at once because it was the same stillness Wren had, the same stillness Coyle had, the stillness of a person whose authority does not depend on volume. He did not grab Vale. He did not touch him at all. He simply stood in his way and said, in a conversational tone that nonetheless reached every ear nearby, "I shouldn't if I were you." "Get out of my," Vale began. "My name is Aldous Wren," the man said, as if Vale had asked, "and until 2 years ago I sat as a magistrate in this city for the better part of 3 decades. I have watched a great many young men do a foolish thing, and then make it very much worse in the following 60 seconds by deciding to run from it. I am going to give you the advice I gave from the bench more times than I can count, and I am going to give it to you for free, which is more than most of them got." He paused. "Stop. Stand still. Wait for the constables, who are already coming. You can hear them if you listen. Apologize when the moment comes, plainly and without theater. It will not undo what you did, but it is the difference between a young man who made a grave mistake and a man who compounded an assault with flight in front of 100 witnesses and a palace full of cameras. One of those is recoverable. The other is not. Choose." It was, I think, the best advice Dorian Vale was ever offered in his life, and he did not take it. Instead, he did the thing that men like him do when they are cornered and frightened and have spent their whole lives never once paying a price. He reached, not for humility, but for the only weapon he had ever known to work. He reached for his name. "Do you have any idea," he said, and his voice cracked up out of the easy mockery into something higher and uglier, "do you have any idea who my family is? Do you know what we own? You're a asterisk retired asterisk nothing, and these are asterisk toy soldiers in fancy dress hats, and I will have every one of you." He turned wildly, taking in the crowd, the gate, the guardsman, the magistrate. "You think this is going anywhere? You think anyone touches me? My grandfather built half the contracts this city runs on. We have lawyers who eat people like you for." "Sir," a new voice, quiet, even-edged, with the flat authority of a man used to being obeyed without a second word. The officer had come out from the arch. He was perhaps 45, gray at the temples, his tunic immaculate, a captain's marks at his collar. He stopped a careful 2 paces from Vale, close enough to command, far enough to take nothing from him that a camera could mistake for aggression. "Captain Eamon Sledge, foot guard, you will lower your voice. You are not under arrest by me. I have no power to arrest you, and I would not touch you if I did. But you have committed an assault on the Queen's forecourt. It has been witnessed by every soul here, and the civil police are 2 minutes out. You may say what you like to me. I would only point out that you are saying it on roughly 40 cameras, and that everything you are saying about who your family is and what your lawyers do is, at this moment, making the case against you considerably stronger than my men ever could. That stopped him. Not the law. Vale did not yet believe in the law as a thing that could reach him. What stopped him was the cameras. The realization, dawning slow and horrible across his face, that the weapon he had brought, the phone, the recording, the clip, had turned in his hand. That he was not the author of the footage anymore. That he was the subject of it. That 40 strangers were, at this very moment, capturing a wealthy young man screaming about his lawyers and his contracts, and his name into the patient face of a foot guard captain who had not raised his voice once, and that no editing in the world would ever make Dorian Vale the hero of that film. He shut his mouth. And in the new silence, under the gilded iron and the watching windows of Harrowgate Palace, everyone on the forecourt heard the sound Aldous Wren had promised was coming. The rising two-note cry of the constable's cars, turning off the ceremonial mile, slowing at the forecourt rail, stopping. The law had arrived. But the law, as I would learn over the strange weeks that followed, was only the smallest part of what Dorian Vale had set in motion when he loosened the lid of a paper cup and decided that a disciplined man's dignity was a thing he could buy for the price of a bet. The arrest itself was almost gentle. 2 constables, a man and a woman, both calm, took Vale's account and the schoolteacher's and the cartman's and a dozen others. They asked Captain Sledge for the names of the guardsmen involved. They took Vale's phone and his friend's phone into evidence, though by then it scarcely mattered whose phone held what, because the forecourt had recorded the morning 40 times over. They cautioned Vale, told him plainly that he was being arrested on suspicion of common assault, and walked him to the car. He went without a struggle, which surprised me until I understood it. A man like Vale does not believe a police car is the end of anything. He believes it is an inconvenience. He believes the real work happens later, in rooms he can afford and the constables cannot, and that whatever is begun on a forecourt by people in uniform is undone in those rooms by people in suits. He climbed into the car almost calm, almost smug again, and I watched the smugness return to his face through the window glass, and I thought, God forgive me, you have no idea. I was wrong about which of us had no idea, but I'll come to that. I went off the post myself 2 hours later, at the changing, and I went straight to the guardroom to find Wren. The burn was not serious. The coffee really had cooled on its way, as he'd told Coyle, and the worst of it was an angry red welt along the line of his jaw and a smaller one at the throat where the collar had held the heat. The regiment's medical officer had seen to it. Wren sat on the edge of a cot with a clean collar and a cup of proper tea, and the particular blankness of a man who has spent every ounce of his composure, and is only now, in private, beginning to feel the cost of it. "You all right?" I asked him, which is a stupid question, and he gave me the answer it deserved, which was a flat look. Then he relented. "I keep thinking about the boy," he said. "There was a boy." In a pram, the father turned it round. I saw. Turned it back after, when the coffee, I heard it, the crowd, and I thought, there's a child watching this. There's a child watching a grown man throw scalding coffee at someone who can't answer and watching the someone do nothing, and what does that teach him? What does a boy learn from that? Wren turned the cup in his hands. And then I thought, no, he's not watching me do nothing. He's watching me hold. There's a difference, and I have to trust the boy will feel the difference even if he can't name it yet. The difference between a man who can't fight back and a man who chooses not to. That's the whole of what I had to give him. So I gave it. I have carried that with me, what Wren said about the boy, for longer than I have carried almost anything. But at the time I only nodded, because there was a knock at the door and it was a runner from the adjutant's office, and the message was for Wren. He was wanted upstairs. It had begun, the part that happened in rooms. By that evening the first clip was online. Not Vale's phone was in an evidence bag, and his friend, it turned out, had got cold feet and posted nothing. The clip that went out into the world was shot by a tourist from the kingdom of Varing, a woman who had been standing slightly behind and to the right, and it caught the whole of it in one unbroken take. The loosened lid, the throw, the dark bloom across the scarlet, the steam, and Ren standing there, eyes forward, the coffee running off his chin, not a muscle moving, while 100 people gasped and a man's voice crowed about money. It was 41 seconds long. By midnight it had been watched 2 million times. By the following midnight, 30. And here is where the story stopped being simple, and where I learned what Dorian Vale's family was actually capable of, which was not, as he'd boasted, making the law go away, but something subtler and, in its way, far worse. They did not deny the coffee. They could not. 40 cameras forbade it. Instead, 2 days after the arrest, a statement appeared from a public relations firm I will not dignify by naming, a firm retained. It was understood by the Vale family. The statement expressed deep regret for an incident that has been widely mischaracterized. It said that Dorian Vale, a young man of previously unblemished character, had been celebrating with friends, and had made a regrettable error of judgment that he wholeheartedly regretted. And then, in the careful poisoned middle of it, it began the real work. It noted that questions have been raised about whether the guardsman had been in any genuine danger, given that the coffee was, by all accounts, only lukewarm. It suggested that the incident had been seized upon and weaponized by those with an agenda against a successful family. It hinted, never said, only hinted that the truly disciplined thing, the truly honorable thing, would have been for everyone to let a young man's single bad moment be forgiven, and that the real cruelty here was the mob that would not let it go. I read that statement standing in the guardroom, and I felt a fury rise in me worse than anything I had felt on the forecourt, because I understood, all at once, what they were doing. They were trying to steal the meaning of the stillness. They were taking the very thing that had made Ren magnificent, that he gave no reaction, that he stood and bore it, and twisting it into proof that nothing much had happened. He didn't even flinch, so it can't have been so bad. They were going to use his discipline as a weapon against the case, the way Vale had tried to use it as a weapon for his clip. The stiller Ren had stood, the more they would argue there was nothing to stand against. It was clever. It was the cleverest, ugliest thing I have ever watched money do, and for about 3 days, in the parts of the public that prefer a complicated villain to a simple one, it began to work. Comment columns filled with people asking whether perhaps everyone had overreacted, whether a lukewarm coffee was really worth a young man's whole future, whether the mob had become the real bully. The number under the clip kept climbing, but the meaning underneath it had begun, horribly, to slide. And in the guardroom, Ren read the statement over my shoulder and read it again, and set it down, and said the only thing he said about it for a long while. Lukewarm, he said quietly, and touched, without quite meaning to, the red welt that still ran along the line of his jaw. Is that what it was? The regiment, I should say, does not court attention. It is one of the oldest things about us, older than any single rule. We stand the watch, we do not give interviews, we let the post speak and keep our own mouths shut. There is wisdom in it. A guardsman who becomes a personality stops being a symbol, and the moment is never about the man, it is about the post, the crown, the thing the man stands for. So the first instinct of everyone above Ren, all the way up, was the instinct it always is: say nothing. Let it pass. Do not feed it. The clip will fade, the columns will move on, the family will spend its money, and the courts will do what the courts do. And the regiment will be where it has always been, standing the watch, long after Dorian Vale is forgotten. It is a good instinct. On almost any other morning it would have been the right one, and for a few days it very nearly cost us everything. Because the silence the regiment kept for honor, the Vale firm read as weakness. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does a comment column. If the only voices speaking are the ones with a story to sell, the story they sell becomes the truth. Day by day, the lukewarm coffee line spread. A second statement appeared, this one quoting an unnamed expert on the realities of ceremonial duty, who opined that guardsmen are trained to expect such high jinks, and that the public should not be manipulated into hysteria over what is, regrettably, an occupational hazard of a tourist attraction. A tourist attraction. As though Wren were a costumed mascot and the forecourt a theme park, and the throwing of scalding coffee into a soldier's face a kind of ride. And then came the part that nearly broke me, because it came from inside. There was an officer, I will not name him, because he is not the villain of this story and he believed sincerely that he was protecting the regiment, who came down to the guardroom and sat with Wren and laid out, kindly, reasonably, the case for letting it go. The family had signaled, he said, that if the matter were not pursued with undue zeal, if Wren declined to give a formal victim statement, if the regiment quietly let the criminal charge soften to the smallest possible thing, then the campaign against the guard would stop. The clips would be left to fade. There would be no lawyers descending on the barracks, no attempt to dig into Wren's record, no long, ugly public fight that the family could afford and the regiment could not. "They're offering peace, Calloway," the officer said. "Take the peace. You stood your post like a hero. Everyone who matters saw it. You don't need a courtroom to prove what the whole kingdom already watched you do. Walk away the bigger man. That's the disciplined choice. That's the honorable one." It was the false dawn, and it was beautifully made because it was dressed in the very virtues Wren lived by. Discipline, restraint, being the bigger man, walking away. Every word of it sounded like Wren's own creed turned back toward a quiet exit. And I watched my friend sit and listen to it, and I watched him weigh it honestly, the way he weighed everything, and I felt the whole thing tilt toward the reasonable, ruinous middle, toward the version where the coffee really does become lukewarm, where the bet is forgotten, where a wealthy young man buys back his future, and the meaning of the stillness is quietly sold for the price of leaving Wren alone. Wren was silent a long time. Then he asked the officer a question. "Sir," he said, "if I take the peace, if I say nothing, give no statement, let it soften to nothing, what does the cartman do?" The officer blinked. "The what?" "The man who sold the coffee. He stood at his urn that morning with his hand frozen on it, sick that his cup had been used that way. He's a witness. He gave the constables his account. If I take the peace and the case goes away, he stood up for nothing worse. He stood up and then watched the man he stood up against buy his way clear, and he learns the lesson that family is teaching the whole kingdom in those columns. That it doesn't matter what you saw, that it doesn't matter how many of you saw it, that there is a kind of person the truth simply doesn't reach. The schoolteacher, the father with the boy, Mr. Wren, the magistrate. 40 strangers who took out their phones and chose in the moment to be witnesses instead of an audience. Wren's voice did not rise. It never did. "They didn't do that for me, sir. I had my post. I didn't need them. They did it because they believed that what they saw mattered, and that telling the truth about it mattered. If I take the peace, I tell every one of them they were fools to bother. I'd rather be burned again." The officer had no answer to that. There isn't one. After a while he stood and put his hand briefly on Wren's shoulder and said, and I believe he meant it, "Then we'll do it your way, Corporal. And God help me, I think it's the right way." And he went back up the stairs to begin the harder, slower work of the regiment standing behind its man, and the false dawn passed, and the real morning, the one that would actually settle the thing, began to come up cold and clear behind it. What turned it in the end was not the regiment, and it was not Wren, and it was not even the law. It was the very crowd Dorian Vale had mistaken for a helpless audience. It was the 40 phones. Because while the Vale firm had been crafting its statements about lukewarm coffee and occupational hazards, the 40 strangers on that forecourt had been doing something the firm never accounted for. They had been talking to each other. The schoolteacher, her name was Constance Yarrow, and I would come to know her well, had stood on that forecourt and given her word to a soldier in front of everyone that the cameras were evidence, and that the law would reach the man. She had said it as a teacher says a thing to a frightened class, to make it true by insisting on it. And then she had watched the lukewarm lie begin to eat that truth alive. And Constance Yarrow was not a woman who said a thing in public and then let it be unsaid by a press release. She found Aldous Wren. The magistrate found the cartman whose name was Beau Halloran. The three of them found, one by one, the others, the father, the nurse, the woman from Varing who had shot the 41-second clip. And quietly, without any firm or any fee, the witnesses of the South Forecourt began to do the one thing no amount of money can buy or unmake. They began to tell the truth, all together in their own voices, where everyone could hear it. It started with Beau Halloran, the cartman, because the lie had a weak point and Beau was standing on it. The whole of the lukewarm defense rested on a guess, that the coffee, being a couple of minutes old, must have cooled to something harmless. But Beau Halloran had not guessed. Beau Halloran had made the coffee. He had been selling it on the ceremonial mile for 19 years from the same cart, off the same urn, and he knew to the degree exactly how hot it left his hand, because he had spent 19 years being careful not to scald the tourists who bought it. So Beau did a simple thing. He filmed himself one morning at his own cart, pouring a cup from the same urn at the same time of day, and he held a little kitchen thermometer in it, the cheap kind, and he let the camera see the number, and he said in his plain, unhurried way, "This is what I sold him. This is the temperature it leaves my cart. They're telling you it was lukewarm. I poured it. I'd no more call that lukewarm than I'd call a kettle a cold tap. He waited 3 minutes and he threw it. 3 minutes off my urn isn't lukewarm. 3 minutes off my urn is still hot enough that I tell folk to mind their lips." And he held the thermometer steady until everyone watching could read it. That little film did more damage to the veiled defense than any lawyer could have, because it was not a statement from a firm. It was a man who made coffee, telling the truth about coffee with a thermometer. There was nothing to spin. The lukewarm line, which had been doing such quiet, poisonous work, simply died, and the people who had begun to half believe it felt, many of them, a flush of shame at having been so easily turned. And there is no public more dangerous to a liar than one that has just realized it was nearly fooled. Then Constance Yarrow spoke. She did not make a film with a thermometer. She did the thing a teacher does, which is to explain. She wrote a single plain account of what she had seen, the 20 minutes of baiting, the loosened lid, the timed wait for the crowd to relax, the throw, the laugh, the word money. And she ended it not with anger but with a question, and the question was the one that undid the whole, single bad moment defense. "They are asking you to forgive a moment," she wrote. "But I stood 4 feet from him for 20 minutes and I'm a teacher, and I know the difference between a moment and a plan. A moment is when a man loses his temper. This was the opposite of losing his temper. This was a man keeping his temper perfectly while he engineered, slowly and on camera, the cruelty he had bet he could commit. There was no moment. There was only patience spent on something vile. Do not forgive him, a moment he never had." And then Aldous Wren, the magistrate, gave the thing its frame. He had sat on the bench 30 years, and he knew exactly how the machinery worked and exactly how it failed, and he wrote about that, about how the only thing that had ever let a certain kind of person escape consequence was the quiet hope that the witnesses would tire, would doubt themselves, would let the louder, richer story stand. "I have watched it from the bench 100 times," he wrote. "The case is never lost in the courtroom. It is lost in the weeks before, when ordinary people who saw the truth are made to feel foolish for trusting their own eyes, until one by one they fall silent, and the only voice left is the one that was bought. The single thing that defeats it is also the simplest. It is witnesses who do not fall silent, so I will not. I saw a young man throw scalding coffee into the face of a soldier who could not answer, and laugh and call it money. I saw it plainly with 30 years of trained eyes, and I will say so to anyone, anywhere, under oath or over a garden fence, for as long as it takes. It became, in the space of a week, something no firm could control. The 41-second clip was joined by the thermometer film, by Constance Yarrow's plain account, by Aldous Wren's frame, and then by the others. The father, who wrote only that he had turned his small son's pram away and would spend years explaining why. The nurse, who wrote about what 3-minute-old commercial coffee actually does to skin and how lucky it was the collar had taken the worst. The woman from Restraint, who said simply that she had come to Eldermore to see something beautiful and had instead seen something true, and that the soldier who would not flinch had taught her more about her host kingdom than any palace tour. The meaning of the stillness, which the Vale firm had tried to steal, came flooding back stronger than before, because now the whole kingdom understood it. He didn't flinch asterisk stopped meaning so it can't have been bad and started meaning what it had always meant. Here is a man who bore the worst a fool could do and gave him nothing, and that is not weakness, that is the rarest strength there is. The number under the clip passed 50 million, and every one of those views now carried the truth with it, welded on, impossible to pry off. The Vale firm went quiet, the statement stopped. There is a point at which spin stops helping and starts drowning, and they had reached it. But the family was not finished. Money is rarely finished while it still has anything left to spend, and they made one last move, and it was the move that finally, completely, undid Dorian Vale in the eyes of the whole kingdom, though they made it believing it would save him. They decided to fight the criminal charge, not to plead, not to apologize, not to take the quiet path Aldous Wren had offered on the forecourt, and that any sensible lawyer would have urged. They decided that with their money and their lawyers they would go to court and win, would argue the lukewarm coffee, the occupational hazard, the manipulated mob, the young man of unblemished character, and that a verdict of not guilty would wipe the whole thing clean and turn Dorian Vale from the villain of 50 million views back into the wronged young man of the press releases. It was an act of breathtaking arrogance, and it was exactly in character, and it gave the truth the one thing it had so far lacked: a room, a date, an oath, and a public reckoning. It gave the witnesses a place to stand. It gave Beau Halloran's thermometer and Constance Yarrow's plain account, and Aldous Wren's 30 trained years a courtroom to be heard in, under oath, on the record, before a magistrate and a press gallery. And though no one in the Vale firm seems to have considered this, the same 40 cameras worth of public that had already returned its verdict on the forecourt. The trial was set for a Thursday in the autumn, and Corporal Wren Calloway, who had given no statement to the press, who had sat through the false dawn and refused the easy peace, who wanted nothing from any of it except to go back to standing his post, was called to give his evidence in person, in uniform on the stand. He had not reacted on the forecourt. Now the whole kingdom waited to hear what he would say when, at last, he was not only permitted to speak but required to. I was there. I had been called too, as a witness from the next sentry box, and I gave my evidence early and plainly, and then was permitted to sit in the gallery for the rest, which I would not have missed for any order short of the Queen's own. The courtroom was small and old and full, the press gallery packed, and at the front, at the defense table, sat Dorian Vale in a sober dark suit chosen for him by people who understood what a jury and a magistrate want to see, his hair cut, his face arranged into something he and his advisers must have practiced as contrition. He looked, for the first time since the forecourt, controlled. And I understood that the family's whole strategy now rested on a single bet, the same kind of bet that had started the whole thing. They were betting that in a courtroom, on the stand, under a clever lawyer's questions, Corporal Wren Calloway, a quiet man, a private man, a man who had never courted a microphone in his life, would falter, would be flustered, would somehow give them the reaction they had failed to win with the coffee. They had not been able to break his stillness on the forecourt. They were going to try to break it on the stand. The cartman went first, with his thermometer entered as an exhibit, and he was unshakable, because there is nothing to shake in a man telling the truth about his own coffee. Constance Yarrow went next, and the defense lawyer tried, gently at first and then less gently, to get her to concede that perhaps she had not seen what she thought she'd seen, that 20 minutes is a long time, that memory plays tricks, and Constance Yarrow looked at him with 30 years of front-of-classroom authority and said, "Young man, I have spent my life watching to see exactly who started it, because in a classroom the one who started it always says he didn't. I know what I saw. Would you like me to describe the loosening of the lid again, or did you hear me the first time?" The gallery did not laugh, quite, because it was a courtroom, but something moved through it, and the lawyer sat down sooner than he'd meant to. And then they called Wren. He came to the stand in full uniform, because the court had asked it, and because the regiment had agreed it was right. Not the bearskin, which would have been theater, but the scarlet tunic, the medals, the bearing. The welt along his jaw had healed by then to a faint mark you would only see if you knew to look, and I knew to look, and I saw it. He took the oath in a voice that carried to the back of the room without being raised, and he sat, and he kept his eyes level, and for a moment the whole courtroom was as still as the forecourt had been, because here at last was the man who would not flinch, and everyone wanted to know what he sounded like when he finally spoke. The prosecutor took him through it simply, where he had stood, what he had seen and felt, what the coffee had done. Wren answered in short, exact sentences the way he did everything. Yes, the coffee was hot. No, he had not moved. Yes, it had hurt. When the prosecutor asked him why he had not stepped back, had not defended himself, had not so much as raised a hand, Wren was quiet a moment, and then he said the thing that ran, within the hour, across the whole kingdom, and that people still quote to me when they learn where I served. "Because the post isn't mine to abandon for my own comfort," he said. "A man threw something at me. That was his choice, and he'll answer for it. Whether I keep my discipline is mine. He could make me burn. He couldn't make me break. Those aren't the same, and the whole worth of the uniform is in the difference." Then the defense lawyer rose, and the family's last bet was placed. He was good, I'll grant him that smooth, patient circling. He tried the lukewarm angle, and Wren simply said, "The thermometer's in evidence, sir. I trusted over my memory and gave him nothing to push against." He tried the occupational hazard angle. Surely a guardsman expects a bit of rough fun. Surely Wren had been jeered at before. Surely this was just the same in kind, if not degree. And Wren said, "I've been jeered at, sir. Jeering isn't scalding. The first is rude. The second is an assault. I can tell them apart, and so, I think, can you." He tried, finally, the angle the whole family had pinned its hopes on. He tried to provoke him. He grew sharper, more personal, suggesting that Wren was enjoying his sudden fame, that he had given no press statements only to seem nobly silent, that the real act here was the soldiers, performing humility for 50 million views, milking a splash of coffee into a national stage. And there it was, the trap, the same trap as the coffee, only dressed for court. Insult the man in public where he cannot easily answer and make him answer wrong, provoke the reaction, win the bet. I watched Wren, and I saw the old enemy rise in him, the flinch, the heat, the body's ancient certainty that this is the moment to strike back, and I saw, exactly as I had seen it 9 feet away on a bright Tuesday, the instant he chose. He did not raise his voice. He did not flush. He looked at the lawyer with the same level eyes he had kept on the middle distance while the coffee ran off his chin, and he said, "Sir, I gave no statements because it was never about me. You're trying to make it about me now, the same way your client tried to make it about me on the forecourt, get the soldier to react, and the act becomes the story instead of the act. I understand the play. I won't help you run it, a beat. I didn't want 50 million people to watch me. I'd have been glad if no one ever did. But they did, and what they saw was true, and you can't make it untrue by getting me to lose my temper in your courtroom. I haven't got a temper to give you. I left it on the moor with my father, who taught me that a man who can be made to dance by an insult was never really standing still in the first place." The lawyer looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "No further questions," and sat down, and I understood that the family's last bet had just gone the way of the first. Because Dorian Vale had bet twice now that Ren Calloway's stillness was a performance with a breaking point he was clever enough to find. And twice in front of the whole kingdom he had been shown the thing he could not afford to learn, that it was not a performance at all. There was no breaking point because there was nothing being held shut by force. There was only a man who had decided, long ago, who he was, and who simply went on being it whether you threw coffee at him or questions. You cannot break what is not under strain. You cannot win a bet against a man who is not playing. The verdict came the next morning. It did not take long. Guilty of assault. There was never any real doubt once the family chose to fight rather than plead. The thermometer, the 40 cameras, the unbroken 41-second clip, the cartman, the schoolteacher, the magistrate, and a soldier whom no one could rattle had seen to that. But the family had wanted a courtroom, and a courtroom gives you more than a verdict. It gives you a magistrate's words, on the record, and those words did what no clip or column ever quite could. They made the meaning of it official. The magistrate was a woman of perhaps 60, and she had listened to the whole of it with the same patience Aldous Wren had once brought to that same bench. And before she passed sentence, she set down her pen and spoke, not to the gallery, not to the cameras, but directly to Dorian Vale, who stood in his sober suit with his practiced contrition beginning, at last, to slip. "You appear to have believed," she said, "that the discipline of the man you assaulted was a kind of helplessness, that because he would not strike you, he could not reach you. I want to correct that for your sake and for the sake of anyone watching who shares the error. The guardsman did not fail to answer you. He answered you completely. He answered you by standing and letting the whole of his kingdom see exactly what you were, with a clarity no shout could have achieved. You were not spared a consequence because he stayed still. You were delivered to one. His restraint is the reason you are standing where you are standing. Had he struck you, you would be the victim of a brawl, and we would be arguing about who started what. He gave you no such gift. He gave you nothing to argue with at all. He simply let you be, on camera, the thing you chose to be. And then the law and a great many ordinary people who refused to look away did the rest." She let that settle. Vale's jaw was working. The contrition was gone now. What was underneath it was the thing I had seen on the forecourt when the schoolteacher first stepped into his path. The dawning, sickening understanding of a man who has spent his whole life never being reached, discovering in public that the reach has finally closed around him. "You bet money," the magistrate went on, "that you could break a disciplined man for a film. I'm going to make the cost of that bet plain because you do not yet seem to understand that you lost it." And she passed the sentence. The maximum the charge allowed, suspended in part but real with conditions, a fine of a size that would have meant ruin to most men and merely humiliation to a Vale community work, a formal record that no firm could scrub, and a requirement that he write in his own hand an apology to be read aloud in court. Not a press release, not a firm's careful poison. His own words, his own hand, out loud in front of everyone. That was the true sentence, the fine the family could pay, the record they would learn to live with. But to stand in a packed courtroom and read aloud, in his own voice, an admission that he had thrown scalding coffee into the face of a man who had done him no wrong, in order to win a bet and harvest a clip, while that man sat 10 feet away in scarlet with the faint mark still on his jaw and did not gloat, did not smile, did not give him even the dignity of an enemy's satisfaction. That was a humbling no money could touch. He read it badly. His voice shook. Twice he stopped, and the courtroom waited in a silence so complete I could hear the press gallery's pens. He said he was sorry. He said he had been foolish and cruel, and that he had thought it was a joke and had learned it was not. He said, and this part was not in the script his lawyers would have written, this part came up out of him raw, that he had watched the clip 50 million people had watched, and that he had not been able to recognize himself in it, and that he understood now that the stranger in the film, the laughing man crowing about money, was who he actually was, and that he did not want to be him any more. Whether that was true, whether it lasted, I cannot tell you. I am not the keeper of Dorian Vale's soul. But I can tell you that when he finished and looked up, he looked finally at Wren, and Wren looked back at him, level and quiet, and gave him a single small nod. Not forgiveness exactly. Acknowledgement. The nod one gives a man who has at last told the truth. And then it was over, and the gallery filed out into the autumn light, and the cameras that had returned their verdict on a forecourt in spring had it confirmed by a court in fall, and Dorian Vale walked out of the building a free man in the legal sense, and a thoroughly humbled one in every sense that lasts. The clip of the verdict and of Wren's words on the stand and of the magistrate's address ran further than the coffee ever had. But it ran differently. The coffee clip had spread on shock. This spread on something steadier and rarer, a kind of public satisfaction that is not cruelty, not the gloating delight Vale had hoped to manufacture, but the deep quiet pleasure of watching the world, for once, set itself right. People wrote to the regiment by the sackful. Not to Wren by name, mostly. They didn't know his name, and the regiment kept it quiet as long as it could, but to the post, to the uniform, to the idea that there are still men who will stand a watch and bear an insult and give nothing back, and let the truth do its slow, certain work. Schoolteachers wrote that they had shown the verdict to their classes. Old soldiers wrote that they had not been so proud of the regiment in years. The father wrote, we knew it was the father, though he didn't say so outright, that his small son, too young to understand any of it, had been told the story anyway, and would be told it again when he was older, because it was the kind of thing a boy ought to grow up knowing. And Wren went back to his post. That is the part I most want you to understand, because it is the part that is most truly him and least like the story the world tells. The world wanted an ending where the hero is changed, lifted, transformed by his moment, promoted, feted, made into something. Wren wanted none of it. He gave his evidence. He heard the verdict. He received the nation's letters with a kind of embarrassed gratitude. And then, the very next week, he put on the scarlet and the bearskin and the white gloves, and he marched back out to the south forecourt and took up the exact post where the coffee had struck him. And he stood it, eyes to the middle distance, exactly as he always had. I stood the next box. We never spoke of it on the post, of course, the post forbids it, but I watched the crowd that gathered that first morning back, and it was a different crowd than the one I had clocked all my years there. They knew. Somehow they always know. They came not to gawk at a costumed man outside a palace, but to stand, for a moment, in the presence of something they had read about and wanted to be near. They were quieter than tourists usually are. Phones came out, but gently, almost reverently. A few people, when they had taken their photograph, did a small thing I had never seen the public do at our post before. They straightened and gave Wren a short nod, the way one disciplined man acknowledges another, and went on their way. He could not return it, but I think he felt it. I think we both did. There was a boy in the crowd that morning. Not the same boy, I have no way of knowing if it was the same boy, but a small one, on his father's shoulders, watching Wren with the enormous serious eyes that children keep for things they sense are important without knowing why. And I thought of what Wren had said in the guardroom, about the boy in the pram, about the difference between a man who cannot fight back and a man who chooses not to, and about trusting the boy to feel the difference even if he could not yet name it. And I understood that this, in the end, was the whole point of the stillness, the thing the bet had never been able to touch, and the lawyers had never been able to spin, and the verdict had only confirmed, that a man standing his post in perfect discipline, refusing to be made to dance, refusing to give his dignity to the worst person who walks up to him, is teaching every watching child a lesson worth more than any clip. That strength is not the loudest thing in the forecourt. That the man who does not move is not the weak one. That you can be hurt without being broken, and that the difference between those two is the whole worth of a life. Some weeks later, the regiment did one quiet thing. There was no medal. Wren would have been mortified by a medal, and besides, you do not give a soldier a medal for the absence of a court-martial, which is what he himself insisted he had earned, with the ghost of a smile when it was raised. But there was a small dinner off the books, just the men of the South Forecourt and Sergeant Coyle and Captain Sledge, and Wren was made, against his strong objection, to sit at the head of the table. And Captain Sledge stood and said only this: "We don't toast a man for standing his post. Standing the post is the post. But I'll tell you what we're toasting. We're toasting that when the whole kingdom was watching, and a clever, wealthy enemy bet everything on the regiment having one man who could be broken, there wasn't one. There wasn't even close to one. He picked the South Forecourt. He could have picked any post in Eldermore. He'd have lost the bet at all of them. And we drank to that, and Wren went red to the ears and stared at the table, and it was, I think, the proudest I ever saw him, though he would deny it to his grave. I will tell you the last of it, and then I will let you go, because the last of it is the part that matters most, and I have been a long time getting to it. A year after the coffee, almost to the day, I was on the South Forecourt at the changing when an old woman came to the rail with a small parcel and asked, very politely, to leave it for the guard who didn't move, the one from the films, if he's still here. It was against every rule to accept a parcel at the post, of course, and I could not have done it even had I wished to, and a steward came and took her name and explained, kindly, the protocol, and she nodded and understood and left the parcel with the steward instead. I learned later what was in it. It was a child's drawing from a school somewhere out in the moor country, the kind of place Wren had come from, a wax crayon picture of a tall red soldier in a black hat, standing very straight, with a brown splash drawn across his front and a great yellow sun behind him, and underneath, in the careful, enormous letters of a 6-year-old, the words, "He did not move." And the old woman, who was the boy's grandmother, had written on the back, in a hand that shook a little, "My grandson asked me to bring this to the brave soldier. He says when people are mean to him at school now, he stands still like the guard, and it makes him strong. Thank you for teaching him without ever knowing his name." Wren kept that drawing. Of all the letters, all the millions of words, the verdict and the sentence and the magistrate's address and the toasts, it was the wax crayon picture from a boy he had never met that he kept, framed, where he could see it. Because that boy was the answer to the question he had asked on the worst morning of his career, the question he had held in his mind while scalding coffee ran off his chin. What does a child learn from watching this? Now he knew. The child learns that you can be hurt without being broken. The child learns that the strongest thing in the world is sometimes the thing that does not move. The child learns to stand still like the guard, and that it makes him strong. Dorian Vale had thrown his coffee to make a man dance. He had wanted to prove that discipline was a performance, that honor was an act, that a man who would not strike back was a man with no power at all. And in the end he had proved the opposite completely in front of the whole kingdom and one small boy on the moors, that the man who does not move is the one who cannot be moved, and that the law and the truth and 100 ordinary witnesses will, given time, do for him every single thing his own raised hand could never have done, and do it better, and do it clean, and leave his dignity, and the crowns, exactly where it had always stood. I went off the post that evening, the year after the coffee, and the South Forecourt was quiet, and the light was going gold over the gilded iron, and Wren Calloway stood his watch behind me, immaculate and unbreakable, eyes to the middle distance, exactly as he always had, exactly as he always would. And I thought, let them come. Let them throw what they like. He will not move. And that, in the end, is the whole of the strength and the whole of the story I have wanted you to understand. He did not move, and it changed everything.